Hey guys, tonight I want you to just settle in. Dim the lights, pull up the blankets, and let's leave the frantic energy of the modern world behind for a while. We're going on a journey back to a time that was, frankly, a bit of a mess, but a very quiet, slow-moving mess. We're going to explore the strange, the tragic, and the deeply questionable lives of the people who came before us. So take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let's begin. Tonight we start with the objects, specifically the everyday items from the medieval and early modern periods that would absolutely terrify a modern person, but were just Tuesday for a 14th century duke. Let's float over to the bedroom first, because if you think your mattress is uncomfortable, you haven't lived the life of a Habsburg prince. In the medieval world, the bed was the most expensive thing you owned. It was a massive wooden fortress of fabric, but inside those beautiful silk hangings was a mattress stuffed with straw, or if you were really fancy, pea shucks. And because why not invite the entire local ecosystem into your sleeping quarters, these mattresses were a literal playground for lice, bedbugs, and the occasional adventurous mouse. They didn't really wash the mattress, they just added more straw. It was a layering system, much like a lasagna of filth. You didn't sleep on a bed so much as you negotiated a peace treaty with the things living inside it. Then there were the bed staffs. These were heavy wooden sticks used to beat the mattress to fluff it up. But history tells us they were also used for, well, everything else. If a servant was annoying, you hit them with the bedstaff. If there was a stray cat, bedstaff. It was the multi-purpose tool of the domestic nightmare. And we can't talk about the bedroom without mentioning the communal nature of it. Privacy is a very modern, very posh invention. In a medieval manner, you slept in a room with your family, your servants, and sometimes a confused goat that wandered in from the hall. It was cozy in the way that a crowded bus is cozy. You'd be drifting off to sleep, and you'd hear the rhythmic snoring of a knight who hadn't bathed since the Crusades. If you needed to go in the middle of the night, you didn't walk down a hallway to a tiled bathroom. You used a chamber pot. This was essentially a ceramic bowl that lived under your bed. Now, the wealthy had nice ones, sometimes painted with little flowers, because nothing says class like a decorative bowl for your own waste. The real problem wasn't the bowl itself, but what happened in the morning. A servant would take that bowl and, more often than not, just chuck the contents out the window. If you were walking to market early in the morning and heard someone shout, "Gare-lou," which is a butchering of the French "regardez l'eau," or watch out for the water, you didn't look up. If you looked up, you lost the game. You just tucked your head and hoped for the best. Of course, the elites thought they were better than this. They had garderobes. This sounds fancy, like a walk-in closet, and it was a closet in a way. It was a tiny stone room built into the castle wall with a hole in the floor that dropped straight down into the moat. The irony here is that they would hang their expensive silk and fur robes in these tiny toilet rooms. Why? Because they realized that the ammonia fumes from the waste actually killed the moths that would otherwise eat their clothes. So the king would emerge for his coronation smelling faintly of a stable, but at least his velvet wasn't moth-eaten. It's a trade-off, I suppose. Speaking of clothes, let's talk about the corset's early, more aggressive ancestor, the busk. This was a piece of wood or bone tucked into the front of a bodice to keep the torso perfectly flat and rigid. It wasn't about a thin waist yet. It was about looking like a very expensive, very stiff wooden plank, because nothing says regal beauty like being unable to bend over or breathe deeply. Then there were the shoes, specifically the poulains. These were shoes with toes so long they had to be stuffed with moss or hay to keep them from flopping around. Some were so long they had to be tied to the knees with little silver chains. Imagine a king trying to walk down a flight of stone stairs in shoes that are 2 feet longer than his actual feet. It wasn't a walk, it was a structural hazard. But of course, the longer the toe, the higher the status, because if you have a 3-foot-long shoe, it clearly means you don't have to do anything productive, like walking or standing without falling over. Let's drift now to the kitchen, or rather, the Great Hall. If you were a medieval noble, your diet was a masterpiece of nutritional errors. They believed that raw vegetables were dangerous and cold for the stomach, so they boiled everything until it was a gray, unrecognizable mush. They also had a weird obsession with hiding food inside other food. They would take a pig, sew the back half of it onto the front half of a capon, and call it a cockentrice. It looked like a genetic experiment gone wrong, but it was the height of dinner party fashion in 1400. They also used something called a trencher. This was a thick, stale piece of bread that served as your plate. You didn't eat the plate, at least not at first. You put your greasy boiled meat on the bread, and the bread soaked up all the juices and the general sadness of the meal. At the end of the dinner, you gave that soggy, meat-flavored bread to the poor at the gate. It was charity, but it was also a very effective way to dispose of your trash. And of course, we have to mention the aqua vitae, or the water of life. This was basically unrefined alcohol that they thought could cure everything from the plague to a bad personality. They would mix it with herbs, lead, and sometimes crushed pearls, because if you're dying of a fever, what you really need is a glass of moonshine with some expensive rocks in it. It was a world of sharp edges and soft, rotting things, a world where your hairbrush was made of hog bristles, and your soap was a mix of wood ash and animal fat that probably took a layer of skin off with the dirt. But they didn't know any better. They just floated through their days smelling of wood smoke and old wool, trying to survive until the ripe old age of 35. Chapter 2. The Tragedy of the Spanish Habsburgs. The Habsburg family tree wasn't so much a tree as it was a very tangled, very confused bush, specifically the Spanish branch. They had this idea that their blood was so divine, so incredibly special, that it simply couldn't be mixed with anyone else's. So they just kept marrying their nieces and their cousins' nieces until the DNA started screaming for help. Let's look at Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. He was the grand finale of the Habsburg experiment. He was born in 1661, and by all accounts, he shouldn't have been. His family had been intermarrying for so long that his inbreeding coefficient was actually higher than if his parents had been siblings. He was a biological impossibility. Charles was known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because surely the reason he couldn't chew his food or speak until he was 4 wasn't the centuries of inbreeding, it must have been a curse. Obviously, a sorcerer did it. He had the famous Habsburg jaw, but in his case it was turned up to 11. His lower jaw protruded so far that his teeth didn't meet. He couldn't macerate his food, so he just kind of swallowed things whole like a very regal snake. His tongue was so large that he could barely be understood when he spoke. He drooled constantly, which I imagine made state dinners a bit of a challenge for the ambassadors. But because he was the king, everyone had to pretend this was totally fine. He was surrounded by a court that treated him like a fragile glass doll. He wasn't allowed to walk long distances because his legs were weak. He wasn't expected to study because his head ached. He spent most of his time playing with dwarfs in the palace or looking at the preserved bodies of his ancestors. Because when your own life is a bit of a disaster, why not go down into the crypt and hang out with Great-Aunt Joanna? Joanna of Castile, by the way, was another highlight of the family's emotional stability. They called her Joanna the Mad, which is a bit harsh, but she did insist on traveling across Spain with her husband's coffin, and she'd open it periodically to make sure he was still there. He was just very dead. Back to Charles. He was married off twice because the Spanish Empire desperately needed an heir. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was a vibrant French princess who was understandably horrified when she met her new husband. She reportedly cried for days. Charles, in his own way, was very kind to her. He just didn't really understand how any of it worked. They spent 10 years together and had no children. The court blamed Marie-Louise, of course, because it's never the king's fault, even if the king can't stand up straight. They tried everything to cure Charles. They brought in exorcists, they made him sleep with the bones of saints. They even brought in a group of wise men from the countryside who suggested he eat a diet of nothing but chocolate and eggs. Surprisingly, that didn't fix his genetic code. When Marie-Louise died, Charles was heartbroken. He was then married to Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was a much tougher character. She realized very quickly that Charles was not going to produce an heir, so she spent her time stealing everything that wasn't nailed down in the palace to send back to her family in Germany. She and Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, who was also Charles's aunt, let's not forget, hated each other. The palace was just these two women screaming at each other, while poor, confused Charles sat in the corner playing with his dogs. As Charles approached the end of his life, he became obsessed with his own death. He insisted that the tombs of his father and grandfather be opened so he could look at their remains. He even kissed the withered hand of his father, Philip IV. It was a macabre, slow-motion collapse of a dynasty. When he finally died at the age of 38, the autopsy report was, well, it was something. The physician famously wrote that Charles's body contained not a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, he had a single testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. It's almost poetic in a very dark, very Habsburg way. He was the living embodiment of an empire that had refused to change, refused to bring in new blood, and eventually just withered away from the inside out. His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession, because, of course, if you don't leave an heir, you might as well leave a continent-wide war as your legacy. Chapter 3. The Damp Disasters of the Plantagenets. So, we've left the sun-baked, dusty courts of Spain, and now we're drifting across the Channel to England. It's raining, of course. It was always raining in the Middle Ages, or at least it feels that way when you read the chronicles. We're moving into the world of the Plantagenets, a family that was essentially a collection of very high-functioning tempers held together by gold crowns and a shared love for arguing in French. If the Habsburgs were defined by their chin, the early Plantagenets were defined by the Angevine rage. It was said they were descended from a literal demon, a Countess of Anjou, who supposedly flew out of a window during Mass because she couldn't sight the consecrated host. And looking at John, you can kind of see why people believed it. John was usually remembered as the villain in Robin Hood, the guy who lost the crown jewels in a swamp, which, to be fair, he absolutely did. But his personal life was its own special kind of logistical and emotional train wreck. John was the youngest of 5 sons, and his father, Henry II, nicknamed him John Lackland because there wasn't any land left to give him. Imagine being the royal backup to the backup's backup. It does things to your personality. John was small, prone to literal floor-rolling tantrums, and had a habit of stealing his vassals' wives, which is generally considered a bad move in the How to Be a Popular King handbook. But the real weirdness starts with his marriage to Isabella of Angoulême. At the time, she was 12.
12. Now, by medieval standards, that was young but not unheard of for a contract. But John didn't just marry her for land. He was obsessed with her. He refused to leave the bedroom. His advisors would be standing outside the door with urgent news about Normandy being invaded, and John would just stay in bed. He was nicknamed Soft Sword by his critics, which is a 1200s version of a very specific, very mean insult. But let's talk about the royal diet again, because John's death is the ultimate cautionary tale for anyone who enjoys a late-night snack. After losing his baggage train and the crown jewels, to the rising tide of the Wash, John was in a bit of a mood. He arrived at Newark Castle and decided to comfort himself by eating a massive quantity of peaches and drinking a lot of raw cider. Now, if you're a 13th century king with a stomach weakened by stress and probably several types of intestinal parasites, eating a mountain of unwashed fruit and fermented apple juice is a bold choice. He developed dysentery almost immediately. It wasn't a noble warrior's death. It was a slow, very messy, very unglamorous exit. He died while a massive thunderstorm raged outside. which the chroniclers loved because it felt like the demons were finally coming to collect that debt from his great-great-grandmother. Let's float over to his descendant, Edward II. If John was the angry one, Edward II was the one who just wanted to be left alone to do some light manual labor. Edward was a large, handsome man who looked exactly like a king should look, but he had a problem, at least according to bored, violent barons of England. He liked digging ditches, and hedging, and rowing. He preferred the company of commoners like blacksmiths and sailors over his own nobles. He also had a very, very close friend named Piers Gaveston. Now, Piers was a bit of a nightmare. He was arrogant. He gave the high-ranking dukes mean nicknames like the Black Dog of Arden, and he basically ran the country through Edward's ear. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, known to history as the She-Wolf, was not thrilled. Imagine moving from the sophisticated, lethal court of Paris to England, only to find your husband is more interested in digging a hole with a guy named Piers than in talking to you. Isabella eventually did what any sensible medieval queen would do. She went back to France, found a boyfriend named Roger Mortimer, raised an army, and came back to overthrow her husband. The story of Edward's death is one of those historical myths that is almost too perfect for a sleepy, dark monologue. The legend says he was killed with a red-hot poker in a way that was meant to mock his personal life. In reality, he probably just died of unfortunate circumstances in a damp cell, or, if you believe some conspiracy theorists, he escaped and lived out his days as a hermit in Italy, finally free to dig as many ditches as he wanted without anyone bothering him. But the prize of the most dysfunctional Plantagenet household has to go to Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. This was the original power couple. Eleanor was the richest woman in Europe, beautiful, brilliant, and tired of her first husband, the King of France, because he was too much like a monk. So she married Henry, who was too much like a whirlwind. They had 8 children, and they spent the second half of their marriage trying to destroy each other. Henry locked Eleanor in a tower for 16 years because she encouraged her sons to rebel against him. Imagine the family dinners. You have the father, who is a workaholic with a wandering eye, the mother, who is a political mastermind living under house arrest, and 4 grown sons who all want the crown right now and are willing to burn down half of France to get it. The eldest son, Henry the Young King, actually died of dysentery while he was in the middle of a war against his own father. On his deathbed, he begged his father to forgive him. Henry II refused to see him, thinking it was a trap. When he found out his son was actually dead, he collapsed in grief. It was a cycle of, I love you, I hate you, let's besiege your castle. It's all very exhausting, isn't it? All that galloping around on horses and screaming about inheritance. It's much better to be here, in the quiet, listen to rain and thinking about how glad we are that we don't have to sleep in a room with a goat or worry about a red-hot poker. Chapter 4, The Golden Blinding of Byzantium. So, we moved away from the rainy wooden halls of the English kings and floated east, toward the Bosporus. Here, the air smells like incense, old parchment, and a very specific kind of looming dread. This is Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. If the Western monarchs were a bit rough around the edges, the Byzantines were the masters of a very polished, very golden form of dysfunction. In Byzantium, being the emperor wasn't just a job. It was being God's vice-regent on earth. You wore boots made of purple silk. You sat on a throne that literally hissed with mechanical lines, and everyone had to press their forehead to the floor when you entered the room. But there was a catch. The Byzantines had this very strange, very specific rule. An emperor had to be physically perfect. He was a reflection of divine order. If you were scarred or mutilated or missing a limb, you were unfit to rule. This led to a terrifyingly polite tradition of political pruning. Instead of killing their rivals, which was messy and permanent, they would simply adjust them. They called it rhinocopia, the cutting off of the nose, or they would slit the tongue. Or, most commonly, they would use a red-hot bowl to blind their enemies. The idea was that you weren't killing the person, which was a sin. You were just making it impossible for them to ever be emperor again. It was a very clinical, very golden sort of cruelty. Let's look at Justinian too. He was a man who truly leaned into the irony of this system. He was an emperor who was overthrown, had his nose cut off, and was exiled to Crimea. Now, for anyone else, having your nose sliced off by a successor would be a sign to retire and maybe take up gardening. But not Justinian. He had a prosthetic nose made of solid gold. He
eventually raised an army of Bulgars, snuck back into Constantinople through an abandoned aqueduct, and took his throne back. He became known as Rhinotomatos, or the Slit-Nosed. Imagine being a coterie, having to keep a straight face while a man with a golden nose and a very vengeful attitude stares you down. He spent the rest of his reign hunting down the people who had mutilated him. He would sit in the hippodrome with his feet on the necks of his enemies while the crowd cheered. It was a very slow, very rhythmic kind of madness. But the Byzantines didn't just reserve this for men. Let's float over to Empress Irene of Athens. Irene was a powerhouse. She was the first woman to rule the empire in her own right. But getting there involved a family dynamic that makes the Plantagenets look like a Sunday school picnic. Irene's son, Constantine VI, was technically the emperor, but Irene liked the power a bit too much. When Constantine tried to exert his own authority, things got tense. Eventually, Irene's supporters cornered the young emperor in the very same purple chamber where he had been born. On his mother's orders, they blinded him. The chronicles say the sun didn't shine for 17 days after that, because even the sky was a bit uncomfortable with the vibe. Irene then ruled alone, signing her name as Irene, Pious Emperor, using the masculine title because, in her mind, she was the only one left standing. The tragedy of the Byzantines was that they were surrounded by so much beauty, the mosaics, the silk, the marble, while living in a constant state of low-grade paranoia. You'd be sipping your wine, looking out at the Hagia Sophia, and wondering if your cupbearer had been bribed by your cousin to ensure you never saw the sunrise again. It was a world where even the names were descriptive and slightly mean. We had Michael the Drunkard, who was exactly what he sounds like. He once famously forced his court to dress up as clergy and perform a mock liturgy using vinegar instead of wine, just for a laugh. Then there was Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer. After a massive victory, he captured 15,000 enemy soldiers. Instead of killing them, he blinded 99 out of every 100 men, leaving the 100th man with one eye so he could lead the others back home. It's said that when the Bulgarian Tsar saw his blinded army returning, he had a heart attack and died on the spot. Chapter 5. The Moon King and the Velvet Dream. We're leaving the blinding gold of the East now, drifting over the dark, pine-scented forests of Bavaria. The air here is colder, crisper, and carries the faint sound of a distant, melancholy opera. We've arrived at the doorstep of Ludwig II of Bavaria, often called the Swan King, or more unkindly, Mad King Ludwig. Ludwig was a man born into the wrong century. He was a 19th century king who desperately wanted to be a 17th century absolute monarch like Louis XIV of France. But while the world was moving toward steam engines and parliamentary democracy, Ludwig was retreating into a world of pure, expensive fantasy. He was tall, strikingly handsome in his youth, and had eyes that always seemed to be looking at something just behind your shoulder, probably a ghost or a very elaborate stage set. He hated Munich. He hated the small-minded politicians who kept asking him to do boring things like sign laws or attend military parades. So he did what any deeply introverted, incredibly wealthy royal would do. He started building castles that looked like they belonged on the cover of a fairy tale book. Neuschwanstein is the most famous one. It's the castle that inspired Disney, but for Ludwig, it wasn't a tourist attraction. It was a private refuge. He built it as a monument to the operas of Richard Wagner, whom he worshipped with an intensity that made everyone in the government very, very nervous. Ludwig spent his nights wandering through the half-finished halls of his castles, dressed in 18th century costumes, talking to the spirits of dead kings. But let's talk about his dinner habits, because this is where the monotone tragedy really sets in. Ludwig became so reclusive that he didn't want to see his own servants. He had a special table designed for his dining room, the Tischlen Decktisch, or the table set yourself. The table was on a hydraulic lift. The servants would set the table in the kitchen downstairs, and then it would rise through a hole in the floor into the dining room. Ludwig would eat alone, but he would insist that the table be set for 3 or 4 people. He would carry on conversations with imaginary guests, usually Marie Antoinette or Louis XIV. He'd offer them wine, discuss French politics, and then the table would sink back down into the floor. As he got older, his teeth started to rot because he had a legendary sweet tooth. He would eat entire bowls of sugar-coated fruit and drink liters of hot chocolate. He grew heavy, his handsome face became bloated, and his grip on reality started to fray at the edges. He stopped sleeping during the day and became a creature of the night. He would go on moonlight sleigh rides through the mountains, his servants dressed in 18th century livery even in the middle of a blizzard. It was beautiful, in a tragic, I'm bankrupting the state kind of way. The Bavarian government grew tired of their king spending money they didn't have on castles they didn't need. They decided to have him declared insane. They didn't even bother to give him a proper medical exam. They just gathered gossip from disgruntled servants. They sent a commission to Neuschwanstein to take him into custody. The tragedy of Ludwig's story is a mystery that still haunts the dark waters of Lake Starnberg. A few days after being deposed, he went for a walk with his doctor. Neither of them returned. Their bodies were found in the shallow water near the shore. The doctor had bruises on his neck, and Ludwig was dead. Some say he committed suicide. Others say he was murdered while trying to escape. But I like to think he just finally floated away into one of those Wagnerian operas he loved so much. He left behind a collection of castles that now make Bavaria more money in tourism than
The Sun King's personal life was a study in absolute excess and strange physical endurance. He had a stomach that was, according to his autopsy, twice the size of a normal human's. He would eat 4 plates of different soups, a whole pheasant, a partridge, a large dish of salad, 2 thick slices of ham, mutton with gravy, and a plate of pastry, all in one sitting. Because why not? He was the sun. The sun needs fuel. But the most famous and perhaps most terrifying aspect of Louis's health was his royal fistula. In 1686, the king developed a very painful, very delicate medical problem in a place where the sun certainly does not shine. For months, he had to be carried around in a chair, pretending everything was fine while he was in absolute agony. Eventually, a surgeon named Charles Francois Felix was tasked with fixing it. Now, this was before anesthesia. Felix spent months practicing the surgery on peasants in the local hospitals who mostly didn't survive the practice until he felt he had the technique down. The surgery on the king was performed in secret, with no one but the inner circle knowing. Louis, in a display of terrifying stoicism, sat through the entire thing without a scream. When it was successful, the court went wild. It became the fashion trend of the year. Nobles started showing up at court with bandages on their backsides, pretending they also had the royal condition, just to be like the king. It is perhaps the only time in history that a surgical wound became a status symbol. But the true tragedy of the Sun King was the sheer, crushing loneliness of his brilliance. As he aged, he saw almost his entire family die. In a single year, he lost his son, his grandson, and his great-grandson to smallpox and measles. The sun was setting on a palace full of ghosts. He spent his final years under the influence of Madame de Maintenon, his secret second wife, who was deeply religious and turned the once glittering court into a somber, silent place of prayer and hushed whispers. Versailles, once a place of scandals and fountains, became a cold, drafty stone box. The king, who had once danced as Apollo in gold leaf, was now a frail old man with a gangrenous leg, being wheeled through the halls he built. When he finally died,
the people of France didn't weep. They held parties in the streets. They were exhausted by his glory. Chapter 8. The Empress and the Marriage Bed. We're drifting away from the fading echoes of Versailles, floating over the Rhine and toward the sprawling Baroque atlases of Vienna. The air here is thicker, smelling of damp stone, heavy coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of Sachertorf. We've arrived at the court of Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburg dominions. If her distant relative, Charles II, was the tragic end of a withered branch, Maria Theresa was the sturdy, defiant trunk of the family tree trying to grow back. She was 23 years old when she inherited the throne, and every king in Europe immediately looked at her and thought, "Excellent, a girl, let's take her land." They treated her like a minor inconvenience, but Maria Theresa had the iron will of a woman who was currently busy ruling an empire while being almost perpetually pregnant. She had 16 children. 16! Let's just sit with that for a second. She spent roughly 20 years of her life in some stage of pregnancy while simultaneously fighting wars against Frederick the Great of Prussia. She would be planning a military siege in the morning and giving birth to an archduchess in the afternoon. It was a level of biological and political multitasking that would make a modern person need a very long nap. Because she was a Habsburg, the marriage of her children was her primary weapon. She treated her daughters like chess pieces. She famously said, "I sacrifice them to the state." And she wasn't joking. She would send her daughters off to marry kings they had never met, in countries where they didn't speak the language, with a list of instructions on how to behave that was longer than a dictionary. Then there was her husband, Francis Stephen. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, only because his wife made it happen. In reality, he was a bit of a decorative ornament in the palace. He was charming, he liked hunting, and he was very good at making money in business, which was lucky because the wars were expensive. But when it came to ruling, Maria Theresa made it very clear who wore the imperial breeches. She loved him deeply, in a way that was almost uncomfortable for the court. When he died, she cut her hair short, painted her rooms black, and dressed in mourning clothes for the remaining 15 years of her life. She spent her days in a small office, surrounded by portraits of her dead husband, continuing to micromanage the lives of her children across Europe. She was a woman of morality. She created something called the Chastity Commission. This was a group of spies who would literally peek through windows and lurk in the bushes of Vienna to make sure no one was having too much fun. If you were caught in a romantic entanglement that wasn't approved by the church, you could be fined, whipped, or exiled. The irony, of course, was that while her spies were busy policing the bedrooms of the middle class, her own court was a swirling vortex of gossip and secret affairs.
As she aged, Maria Theresa became a formidable figure, literally. She grew quite large, and because she suffered from the heat, she had a system of pulleys and chairs designed to move her around the palace so she wouldn't have to walk. She would sit on her balcony, wrapped in furs even in summer, looking out over a Vienna that she had shaped in her own image, grand, rigid, and deeply, deeply complicated. Chapter 9. The Masquerade of the Swedish Apollo. We're drifting away from the heavy, black-draped windows of Maria Theresa's Vienna, floating north over the Baltic Sea. The air becomes sharp and cold, turning into a pale, silvery blue as we reach Stockholm. We've arrived at the court of Gustav III of Sweden, a man who viewed the entire world as a stage, and himself as the undisputed lead actor. If the other monarchs we visited were obsessed with power or piety, Gustav was obsessed with the aesthetic. He came to the throne in a time when the Swedish monarchy had been stripped of its power, reduced to little more than a rubber stamp for a bickering parliament. But Gustav had read too many plays about absolute kings. In 1772, he staged a coup d'etat that was so theatrical it almost felt scripted. He marched into the streets, gave a stirring speech, and wore a white silk handkerchief tied around his arm. Everyone was so dazzled by the performance that they simply forgot to resist.
He took back absolute power without shedding a single drop of blood. It was his greatest opening night. Gustav was a man of the Enlightenment, but a very peculiar one. He founded the Swedish Academy and the Royal Opera, and he spent a truly staggering amount of money on costumes. He designed a national costume for the Swedish nobility, which essentially made everyone look like they were extras in a Renaissance drama. He believed that if everyone looked elegant and uniform, they would stop arguing about politics, because in Gustav's mind, a well-coordinated wardrobe was the key to national stability. But behind the silk waistcoats and the powdered wigs, his personal life was a bit of a quiet disaster. He was married to Sophia Magdalena of Denmark, a woman who was as shy and silent as Gustav was loud and flamboyant. They lived in the same palace for 9 years without ever figuring out how to produce an heir. The rumors in the court were vicious. People whispered that the king didn't understand the mechanics of the situation, or that he was simply too busy rehearsing his next play to bother with the royal bedchamber. Eventually, the king had to hire a stable master named Count Monk to assist. The historical records are delicately vague about exactly what happened, but shortly after the count's intervention, a prince was born. The scandal was immense. Gustav's own mother publicly accused him of not being the father, and the king reacted by essentially ghosting his mother for the rest of her life. It was a family feud conducted through very polite, very icy letters. As the years went on, Gustav became increasingly paranoid. He lived in a world of mirrors and secret passages. He would stay up all night writing plays or planning elaborate balls, then sleep all day behind thick velvet curtains. He moved to the Palace of Haga, a smaller, more intimate setting where he could pretend the French Revolution wasn't happening just a few hundred miles to the south. But the theater of his life was destined for a tragic finale. In March 1792, during a masquerade ball at the Royal Opera House, the very building he had commissioned, a group of disgruntled aristocrats finally caught up with him. Despite receiving a warning letter earlier that evening, Gustav refused to cancel the party. He wore a mask and a shimmering Venetian cape, thinking his charisma would protect him. He was shot in the back by a man named Ankerstrom. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but in the 18th century, a lead ball in the hip usually meant a slow, agonizing slide toward sepsis. Gustav lingered for nearly 2 weeks. Even as he was dying, he remained the director. He pardoned most of the conspirators, arranged the details of his own funeral, and made sure he looked dignified in his bed. He died as he lived, surrounded by worried courtiers, making sure his lighting was just right. Chapter 10. The Dying Embers of the Medici. We're drifting away from the snowy, blood-stained floors of the Swedish opera, floating south over the Alps. The air begins to thicken with the scent of cypress, rosemary, and very old, very damp marble. We've reached Florence. Now, usually, when people think of the Medici, they think of the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci, gold coins, and the birth of modern banking. But we're not here for the glory days. We're here for the end. We're visiting the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, when the once mighty Medici line had devolved into a collection of eccentricities that would make a Habsburg blush.
He didn't just stay in bed. He turned his bedroom into the seat of government. He would receive foreign ambassadors while wearing a nightcap and a stained dressing gown. He stopped shaving, stopped bathing, and surrounded himself with a group of young, rowdy men he called the Ruspanti. He paid them to entertain him, which mostly involved them running around the palace, playing pranks, and causing chaos while the Duke watched from under his silk duvets. There is something profoundly quiet and sad about the image of the last of the Medici, the family that funded the Renaissance, spending his final years eating sweets in a darkened room, surrounded by people who were only there for the paycheck. He knew the line was dying with him. He knew that as soon as he breathed his last, the great powers of Europe would swoop in and hand Tuscany over to the Austrians like a piece of used furniture. When John Gastone finally died in 1737, the Medici era didn't end with a bang or a revolution. It ended with a soft, tired sigh. His sister, Anna Maria Luisa, the very last of the line, did one final noble thing. She signed the family pact, ensuring that all the Medici art collections, the statues, the paintings, the jewels, would stay in Florence forever. She saved the soul of the city, while her family's bloodline simply flickered out. And so we leave the quiet, dusty halls of the Pitti Palace. We've traveled from the straw mattresses of the Middle Ages to the golden noses of Byzantium, from the snowy sleigh rides of Bavaria to the darkened bedrooms of Florence. The world of the past was a strange, often tragic place, full of people who were trying their best to be important while dealing with their own fragile human messiness. Take another deep breath. The stories are done for tonight. The kings and queens are back in their books, and the palaces are quiet. You're safe, you're warm, and the modern world is still waiting for you tomorrow. But for now, just let the silence settle in. Sleep well. Chapter 11. The Victorian Museum of Mourning. We are floating away from the sun-drenched, stagnant canals of Florence and moving forward in time, crossing the English Channel once again. The air is thick now, not with the smell of the medieval moat, but with the heavy, cold-choked fog of London in the mid-1800s. We are entering the world of the Victorians, a society that took the concept of grief and turned it into a complex, multi-billion-dollar industry. If the previous centuries were afraid of death, the Victorians decided to invite it over for tea, dress it in black crepe, and take its photograph. At the center of this obsession was, of course, Queen Victoria herself. When her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, Victoria didn't just mourn, she turned mourning into a lifestyle brand. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. But it went deeper than clothes. She ordered that Albert's rooms in every royal residence be kept exactly as they were the moment he died. Every morning for 4 decades, servants would bring hot water for his shaving mug and lay out a fresh suit of clothes for a man who had been in a crypt for 20 years. It was a slow, rhythmic devotion to a ghost. But this royal sadness trickled down to the masses, creating a set of rules that would terrify a modern person. If you were a Victorian widow, you were expected to disappear into deep mourning for a full year. This meant wearing Parramatta silk or bombazine, fabrics that were scratchy, heavy, and dyed a flat, light-absorbing black. You had to wear a weeping veil of black crepe that was so thick it actually irritated the skin and eyes. Because why just be sad when you can also be physically uncomfortable? Let's talk about the jewelry, because this is where things get truly sleepless historian levels of weird. The Victorians loved memento mori, or reminders of death. The most common form was hair jewelry. They would take the hair of a deceased loved one and weave it into incredibly intricate patterns, flowers, wreaths, even miniature landscapes, and set them under glass in brooches or rings. You weren't just remembering grandma, you were wearing a piece of her keratin on your lapel. It was considered the height of sentimentality. Then there were the post-mortem photographs. Photography was new and expensive, and often a family wouldn't have a single image of a loved one while they were alive. When a child died, the photographer would be called in to take one final portrait. They would dress the deceased in their best clothes, sometimes prop their eyes open, or paint pupils onto the closed eyelids of the photograph later to make them look asleep or alert. It sounds macabre to us, but for them it was the only way to freeze time, to keep a shadow of a person who was already gone. But the fear of death in the Victorian era was paired with a very specific, very rational terror: being buried alive. This was the era of safety coffins. Inventors made fortunes designing caskets with breathing tubes, air pumps, and, most famously, little bells. The idea was that if you woke up 6 feet under, you could pull a string, ring the bell, and the cemetery watchman would come dig you up. There is no recorded instance of a bell actually saving anyone, but it certainly made people feel better as they drifted off into their final sleep. Even the flowers were part of the system. We think of lilies as funeral flowers today because they look peaceful. The Victorians used them because they had an incredibly strong scent, strong enough to mask the unpleasantness of a body being kept in the parlor for a week before the funeral. Everything was a layer, a way to beautify the grim reality of the biological process. It was a world of black-plumed horses, jet bead necklaces, and tear bottles, tiny glass vials where you would supposedly collect your tears of grief. If the bottle evaporated, your mourning period was officially over. It was a very organized, very expensive way to say goodbye.
Chapter 12. The Salty Immortality of the Pharaohs. We are floating away from the soot-stained windows of Victorian London, drifting across the Mediterranean toward the heat shimmer of the Egyptian desert. The air here is different. It's bone-dry, smelling of sand, cedar oil, and the sharp alkaline tang of natron salt. We've arrived in the Valley of the Kings, but not during the time of the tourists. We're going back to the era of the New Kingdom, where death wasn't an end, but a very long, very complicated administrative process. The Egyptians were the ultimate planners. To them, the afterlife was basically just life, but with better weather and fewer taxes. However, to get there, you had to keep your body intact. This led to the creation of the most elaborate DIY project in human history: mummification. If the Habsburgs were defined by their chins, the pharaohs were defined by their ability to be turned into human jerky. The process was frankly a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare. First, they had to deal with the brain. The Egyptians thought the brain was just a useless organ for producing snot. The heart was where the thinking happened. So they would take a long bronze hook, insert it through the nose, and, well, they would whisk. They'd turn the brain into a liquid and pour it out. Imagine being a royal embalmer, trying to explain to the king's ghost why you're essentially scrambled egging his intellect through his nostrils. Because why not start the journey to eternity with a bit of casual neurosurgery? Then there were the canopic jars. They would remove the stomach, the lungs, the liver, and the intestines. These weren't just tossed away. They were placed in 4 jars topped with the heads of the sons of Horus: a human, a jackal, a baboon, and a hawk. It's a very specific kind of interior decorating. You're essentially spending eternity with your internal organs stored in a set of matching ceramic canisters on the shelf next to you. The body itself was then packed in natron salt for 40 days. It was essentially the same process used to make salt cod, just on a much more prestigious scale. By the time the 40 days were up, the pharaoh was no longer a person. He was a leathery, darkened version of himself, ready to be stuffed with linen, sawdust, or lichen to make him look plump again. They would even put onions in the eye sockets to give the face some shape, because nothing says divine ruler like a couple of shallots where your eyes used to be. But the real irony of the Egyptian obsession with preservation is what happened thousands of years later. In the Victorian era we just left, mummy brown was a popular paint pigment. Yes, they would actually grind up ancient Egyptians to make a specific shade of brown paint for artists. And in the 17th century, mumia, powdered mummy, was sold in apothecaries as a cure for everything from headaches to stomach cramps. You might be a king who built a pyramid to live forever, only to end up being swallowed as a pill by a confused merchant in London who has a bit of a cough. The Egyptians lived in a world where the transition to the next life was a literal physical journey. They were buried with shabtis, tiny figurines meant to do their chores in the afterlife. If the gods asked the pharaoh to dig a ditch or harvest some wheat in the fields of reeds, the pharaoh would just point at the little blue statues and go back to his nap. It was the ultimate out-of-office reply. It was a culture of incredible permanence and incredible fragility. They built mountains of stone to protect their bodies, only to be undone by the simple passage of time and the curiosity of people who thought a pyramid was just a very large treasure chest. Chapter 13, The Golden Cage of the Forbidden City. We're drifting away from the silent, salt-crusted tombs of Egypt, floating high above the Silk Road and over the Great Wall, descending into the heart of Beijing. The air here is heavy with the scent of sandalwood, coal smoke, and the peculiar metallic tang of thousands of brass bells chiming in the wind. We've entered the Forbidden City, the massive, crimson-walled labyrinth where the Ming and Qing emperors lived out their lives as sons of heaven. If Versailles was a stage, the Forbidden City was a golden cage. The emperor was so sacred that he wasn't really a person, he was a cosmic necessity. He lived in a world where almost no one was allowed to look at his face. He walked on paths that no one else could touch, and his life was governed by a schedule so rigid it makes a modern calendar look like total anarchy. Every single movement, from the moment he opened his eyes to the moment he lay down to sleep, was recorded by a small army of eunuchs and officials. Let's talk about the eunuchs, because they were the true ghosts of the palace. There were thousands of them, men who had undergone a voluntary and incredibly dangerous surgical procedure just for the chance to work in the inner sanctum. They were the only males allowed in the inner quarters of the emperor, and they held an amount of power that was frankly terrifying. They were the emperor's hands, his ears, and often his only friends. But it was a relationship built on a foundation of absolute control and deep, quiet tragedy. The emperor's daily life was a masterpiece of boredom. For breakfast, he would be presented with dozens of dishes: pork, duck, bird's nest soup, but he was only allowed to take 2 or 3 bites of each. Why? Because if he ate too much of one thing, an assassin might figure out his favorite dish and lace it with poison. So the Son of Heaven spent his life surrounded by the most delicious food in the world, yet he was never actually allowed to enjoy a full meal. He was perpetually, royally unsatisfied. And then there were the imperial wardrobes. The emperor would change his clothes up to 12 times a day. There were specific robes for meeting officials, specific robes for praying, and even specific robes for watching the moon. Each one was embroidered with dragons that had 5 claws, because if you wore a dragon with 4 claws, you were basically asking for a death sentence. It was a world where a misplaced thread could be seen as an omen of a failing dynasty.
But the most claustrophobic part of the emperor's life was the isolation. Many emperors never actually left the Forbidden City. They spent their entire lives within those red walls, surrounded by people who were paid to tell them they were gods. One emperor, the Qianlong Emperor, was so obsessed with his own image that he spent his days writing thousands of poems and stamping them onto priceless ancient paintings. It was the 18th century version of leaving a like on every piece of art in your house, except his likes were permanent ink stamps that devalued the art for everyone else. As the Qing dynasty began to crumble in the late 19th century, the contrast between the palace and the real world became haunting. While the rest of China was dealing with colonial wars and famine, the Empress Dowager Cixi was spending the naval budget on a marble boat that couldn't even float. She'd sit in her gardens being fed grapes by eunuchs, while the modern world was quite literally banging at the gates with steamships and cannons. The end of the Forbidden City came not with a bang, but with a young boy named Puyi. He became emperor at the age of 2. He grew up in a palace where he was the absolute master of thousands of adults, yet he wasn't allowed to play with other children. He was told he was a god, but he couldn't even leave his own front yard. When the revolution finally happened, he was allowed to stay in the palace for a few years as a sort of living museum exhibit, a ghost of a dead empire, wandering through silent, dusty halls. Chapter 14,
the frozen silence of the Northwest Passage. We're drifting away from the red walls and golden tiles of the Forbidden City, floating over the vast white expanse of the Siberian tundra and across the churning gray waters of the Arctic Circle. The air here doesn't smell of incense or old silk anymore. It smells of salt, dry snow, and the metallic, biting scent of extreme cold. We've reached the 1840s, joining the crew of the Franklin expedition, 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, which were, at the time, the most advanced pieces of technology on the planet. Sir John Franklin was a man who had already survived the Napoleonic Wars and several Arctic treks, but he was getting on in years. He was a bit stout, a bit slow, and perhaps a bit too confident in the power of British steam and iron. He set off with 128 men to find the Northwest Passage, a shortcut to the riches of the East that didn't involve sailing all the way around South America. They brought with them 3 years' worth of food, a library of 1,200 books, and even a hand organ that played 10 different tunes, because if you're going to be trapped in the ice, you might as well have a soundtrack. But the iron ships and the hand organ were no match for the slow, crushing weight of the Arctic. The ships became beset, which is a polite way of saying they were frozen into the ice like flies in amber. And they stayed that way for years. Imagine the daily life on those ships. It wasn't a world of adventure, it was a world of darkness. During the winter, the sun doesn't rise for months. The men lived in a cramped wooden world lit by flickering oil lamps, listening to the ice groan and pop against the hull with the sound of a pistol shot. Then the tin cans started to betray them. This was the early days of canned food, and the contractor who supplied the expedition had done a rush job. The cans were sealed with lead solder. As the men ate their soup and their salted meat, they were slowly, rhythmically poisoning themselves. Lead poisoning doesn't kill you quickly. It just makes you tired, confused, and prone to paranoia. It was a slow-motion disaster happening inside their very blood. When Franklin died, the leadership fell to Francis Crozier, a man who had spent his life being the second in command and now was in charge of a nightmare. Eventually, the ships were abandoned. The remaining men decided to walk. They planned to pull the heavy lifeboats across the ice, filled with supplies, hoping to reach a trading post hundreds of miles away. But this is where the story becomes truly eerie. When search parties found the remains of these groups years later, they found things that made no sense. They found a lifeboat containing 2 skeletons, and inside the boat were things like silver teaspoons, silk handkerchiefs, and heavy books. Under the influence of lead poisoning and scurvy, the men had lost the ability to prioritize. They were starving and freezing, yet they were dragging heavy crates of Victorian niceties across the jagged ice. They were trying to keep their dignity while the Arctic was stripping away their humanity. There is a profound, icy silence to the end of the Franklin expedition. No one survived. They just vanished into the white. For over 150 years, the ships remained hidden beneath the waves, perfectly preserved by the cold. When they were finally discovered in 2014 and 2016, they were like time capsules. The plates were still in the racks. The officers' desks were still filled with papers. It was as if the crew had just stepped out for a moment and forgot to come back. It's a reminder that even our most advanced technology is just a thin skin over a very cold, very indifferent world. The men of the Erebus and the Terror were victims of their era's confidence, drifting into a white void where even their names were eventually erased by the wind. Chapter 15. The Marble Tear on the Face of Time. We are drifting away from the howling winds and the leaden silence of the Arctic, floating south across the Himalayas and descending into the humid, spice-laden air of India. The air here is heavy and sweet, smelling of jasmine, sandalwood, and the damp earth of the Yamuna River. We have arrived at the peak of the Mughal Empire during the reign of Shah Jahan, the fifth emperor, a man of immense wealth, exquisite taste, and a heart that was perhaps a bit too fragile for the throne. If the emperors of the Forbidden City were prisoners of ritual, Shah Jahan was a prisoner of his own devotion. He was deeply, almost obsessively in love with his wife, Mumtaz Mahal. This wasn't a standard royal arrangement of convenience. They were inseparable. She was his chief political advisor, his confidant, and his constant companion, even accompanying him on military campaigns across the dusty plains of the Deccan.
But as we've seen so often tonight, royal lives are frequently punctuated by biological tragedies. Mumtaz Mahal died in 1631 while giving birth to their 14th child. Shah Jahan was devastated. The chronicles say his hair turned white almost overnight. He locked himself in his chambers for 8 days, refusing food or music. And when he finally emerged, he decided to build a tomb that would reflect the beauty of what he had lost. He spent the next 20 years building the Taj Mahal. It wasn't just a building, it was a massive white marble distraction from his grief. He brought in precious stones from all over the world, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, turquoise from Tibet, jade from China. Thousands of elephants were used to haul the marble. It was a project of such scale that it nearly bankrupted the empire. But for Shah Jahan, the cost was irrelevant. He was trying to turn a memory into a physical mountain of stone. But while the emperor was looking at marble flowers and calligraphy, his sons were looking at the throne, specifically his son Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was the polar opposite of his father, stern, puritanical, and possessed of a cold, calculated ambition. He didn't care for poetry or white marble. He cared for power. In a slow-motion coup that feels like a Shakespearean tragedy, Aurangzeb defeated his brothers and declared his father unfit to rule. But he didn't kill Shah Jahan. Instead, he did something perhaps more cruel. He imprisoned his father in the Agra fort. For the final 8 years of his life, Shah Jahan lived in a suite of rooms that overlooked the river. From his balcony, he could look out across the water and see the Taj Mahal, the shimmering white tomb of the woman he loved, standing perfectly in the distance. He could see it, but he could never go to it. He spent his days in a velvet-lined prison, a former master of the world, reduced to a spectator of his own legacy. There is an ironic, quiet sadness to those final years. The man who had commissioned the most beautiful building on earth was now just an old man in a room, watching the sun set over the marble domes, waiting for his own heart to finally stop. When he died, he was buried next to Mumtaz, the only person who had ever truly known him. Aurangzeb, ever the pragmatist, gave his father a modest funeral, essentially tidying away a century of Mughal romanticism to make room for his own harsher era. It's a world of immense beauty and immense coldness, a world where you can own everything, yet end up with nothing but a view of a grave. Chapter 16. The Tragic Brilliance of the Mozart Family. We are drifting away from the humid, white-domed shores of the Yamuna River, floating back toward the heart of Europe. The air grows cooler and crisps into the mountain air of Salzburg, Austria. It smells of old violin varnish, beeswax candles, and the faint, dusty scent of sheet music. We are entering the 1760s, moving into the home of Leopold Mozart, a man who was a respectable musician, but a truly world-class stage parent. In the world of the Enlightenment, a child prodigy was more than just a talented kid. They were a scientific curiosity. People looked at them the same way they looked at a new species of bird or a rare comet. And Leopold realized very early on that he had hit the biological jackpot. He didn't just have one talented child, he had two.
Wolfgang, of course, is the name everyone knows, but his older sister, Nannerl, was just as much of a phenomenon. Leopold decided that the best way to utilize this double dose of genius was to pack the family into a carriage and spend the next several years dragging them across every muddy road in Europe. Imagine the life of these children. It wasn't a childhood of games or friends. It was a life of rhythmic, monotonous travel. They spent thousands of hours in cramped, jolting carriages, moving from one palace to another just to perform for bored aristocrats who wanted to see if the miracle children were real. Wolfgang was so small he had to stand on a chair to reach the keys. He was dressed in miniature court suits with powdered hair and a little sword, looking like a tiny musical doll. He would play with a cloth over the keyboard, or play with his eyes closed, or improvise on themes provided by the audience. It was a circus act, but the music was divine. And because why not double down on the pressure, Leopold constantly reminded them that they were the family's primary source of income. If the children didn't play well, the family didn't eat well. But there is a quiet tragedy in the shadow of Wolfgang's fame, his sister, Nannerl. As a young girl, she was considered her brother's equal, often receiving top billing in their early concerts. But as she approached her teenage years, the 18th century rules for women began to close in around her. In the eyes of society and her father, it was fine for a little girl to be a musical genius, but it was unseemly for a grown woman to have a career. So, while Wolfgang was encouraged to travel to Italy and Paris to become a composer, Nannerl was left behind in Salzburg. She was told to stay home, practice her harpsichord in private, and wait for a suitable marriage. She spent the rest of her life as a music teacher in a small town, watching from a distance as her brother became the most famous man in Europe. She kept all of his letters, preserved every scrap of his music, and lived in the quiet, dusty memory of those years when they were both the wonders of the world. Wolfgang's own life was his own kind of frantic, beautiful mess. He was a man who could write a masterpiece in the morning and spend the evening playing billiards and making off-color jokes. He was perpetually in debt, despite making more money than most musicians of his day. He had a taste for fine clothes, red velvet coats with gold buttons, and a habit of spending money before he had even earned it.
Tycho was a Danish nobleman who was as brilliant as he was eccentric, which, as we've learned tonight, is a very potent combination. He lived in a research palace called Oranienburg, the Castle of the Heavens. He didn't have a telescope yet, they hadn't been invented, for the stars. He measured the heavens with massive, handcrafted instruments made of wood and gold, tracking the movements of the planets with a rhythmic, obsessive precision that had never been seen before. But let's look at the man himself, because Tycho was a walking collection of ironic contrasts. In his youth, he got into a duel with another student over a mathematical formula, because that is the most 16th century thing imaginable, and lost a large chunk of his nose. For the rest of his life, he wore a prosthetic nose made of an alloy of gold and silver. He carried a small jar of adhesive with him, and during dinner parties, he would occasionally have to pause to glue his nose back on. It's a very quiet, very specific kind of dignity. Tycho's household was its own theater of the absurd. He had a pet elk that supposedly lived in the castle and followed him around like a dog, until it unfortunately drank too much beer at a banquet and fell down a flight of stairs. He also kept a court jester named Jeppe, a person with dwarfism whom Tycho believed was psychic. During dinner, Jeppe would sit under the table, and Tycho would feed him scraps of food while listening to his prophecies. Imagine the scene. A man with a golden nose, a drunken elk, and a psychic under the table, all while the most accurate data in the history of science was being recorded in the room next door. But the true tragedy of the early astronomers was the sheer, crushing isolation of their brilliance. They were looking at a universe that no one else understood. When Tycho saw a new star,
a supernova in 1572, it shattered the medieval belief that the heavens were perfect and unchanging. He was looking at the death of an old god, and he was doing it alone, in the cold, while the rest of the world slept. His assistant, Johannes Kepler, was a different kind of lonely. Kepler was a man of celestial harmonies. He spent decades trying to prove that the orbits of the planets followed the same ratios as musical scales. He believed the universe was a giant silent orchestra, and he was the only one with the sheet music. He lived a life of constant motion, fleeing religious wars and poverty, all while trying to calculate the elliptical orbit of Mars by hand. Imagine doing thousands of pages of long division by candlelight, knowing that if you carry one wrong digit, the entire universe falls out of alignment. Tycho's death was as strange as his life. At a royal banquet in Prague, he felt it would be a breach of etiquette to leave the table before the Baron did, even though he desperately needed to use the facilities. He sat there for hours, suffering in polite silence. He developed a bladder infection and died 11 days later. His last words were, "Let me not seem to have lived in vain." And he didn't. He left his data to Kepler, who used it to unlock the laws of planetary motion. They were the bridge between the world of magic and the world of math. They lived in the dark so that we could understand the light. And now we have reached the end of our long, slow walk through the gallery of the past. The stars that Tycho measured are still there, blinking in the same cold silence. The kings have crumbled, the palaces have emptied, and the golden noses have been buried in the dust. The world is very old, very strange, and finally, very quiet. Chapter 21. The Arsenic Green of the Victorian Parlor. We are drifting away from the cold, celestial balconies of Tycho Brahe, floating back down through the atmosphere until the stars become mere pinpricks of light. We find ourselves back in the mid-19th century, but we aren't in a palace or a tomb tonight. We are in a comfortable middle-class home. The air is warm, smelling of coal fire and beeswax, but there is something else, a faint, sweet garlic-like scent lingering in the back of the throat. We have entered the world of the accidental poisoners. If the medieval world was afraid of demons, the Victorians should have been afraid of their interior decorators. In the mid-1860s, there was a specific color that everyone obsessed over, Scheele's green. It was a vibrant, lush emerald that made wallpaper look like a living forest and dresses look like they were woven from moss. It was beautiful, it was modern, and it was made almost entirely of copper arsenate. Yes, the Victorians were literally lining their walls with arsenic. Imagine the life of a child in a nursery decorated with this fashionable green wallpaper. As the damp London air hit the walls, the arsenic would react with the mold in the paste, releasing a toxic gas. The children would grow pale, lose their hair, and waste away, while their parents, frantic with grief, sat by their bedsides in the very same room, breathing in the same deadly emerald air. It's a very quiet, very specific kind of dignity. But it wasn't just the walls. The green menace was everywhere. It was in the artificial flowers women wore in their hair that dusted the dancers at balls with poison. It was in the green food coloring used to make jellies and candies look appetizing. There were cases of entire dinner parties falling ill because the aesthetic dessert was essentially a block of sugar and arsenic. It's the ultimate irony of the era, a society obsessed with hygiene and progress accidentally killing itself with a color. And then there were the cosmetic dangers. To be beautiful in the 19th century was to be pale, deathly pale. To achieve this look, women would apply Venetian ceruse, a thick white paste made of lead. Over time, the lead would eat away at the skin, causing sores and scarring, which led the women to apply even more lead to hide the damage. It's a vicious, heavy metal cycle. Some would even eat arsenic wafers to clear their complexion, believing that a little bit of poison would give them a translucent, angelic glow. They were literally becoming ghosts before they were dead. Even the gentlemen weren't safe. Their hats were often lined with mercury to keep the felt smooth and shiny. The Mad Hatter wasn't just a character in a book. It was a common medical reality for workers in the hat industry who suffered from tremors and hallucinations caused by mercury poisoning. They lived in a world where your clothes, your food, and your home were all quietly, rhythmically trying to end you. There is a profound, quiet horror in the domesticity of the Victorian era. It was a world that valued appearance above all else, creating a gilded surface that hid a mountain of chemical errors. They wanted their world to be bright and permanent, not realizing that the very tools they used to create that permanence were the things that made their lives so fragile.
Chapter 22. The Driftwood Fate of the Mutineers. We are drifting away from the arsenic-stained parlors of London, floating over the white cliffs and out across the vast, rolling blue of the Pacific Ocean. The air here is warm and heavy, smelling of salt spray and the sweet, dizzying scent of tropical hibiscus. We have reached the late 1700s, trailing in the wake of the HMS Bounty. Most people know the story of the mutiny, the breadfruit, the angry Captain Bligh, and Fletcher Christian's dramatic defiance. But the true sleepy tragedy began after the shouting stopped. Once the mutineers had set Bligh adrift in a tiny boat, they found themselves in a terrifying kind of freedom. They were men without a country, pirates by law, and they knew the British Navy had a very long memory and a very short rope for people like them. They ended up on Pitcairn Island, a tiny, jagged tooth of rock in the middle of nowhere that had been misplaced on the Royal Navy's charts. It was the perfect hiding place because officially it didn't exist. They stripped the Bounty of everything useful and then set her on fire, watching as the only bridge to their old lives sank into the turquoise water in a cloud of black smoke. They were now the only humans on a speck of land just 2 miles long. But paradise is a heavy thing to carry. The colony was a collection of 9 mutineers, 6 Polynesian men, and 19 women. And because they had brought the old world's prejudices to the new world's shores, things began to unravel with a slow, rhythmic inevitability. They couldn't agree on how to divide the land. They couldn't agree on, well, anything. Within a few years, the island had turned into a miniature, isolated war zone. It wasn't a battle of armies. It was a series of quiet, domestic betrayals in the dark. One by one, the men began to kill each other over perceived slights or land disputes. By 1799, only one mutineer was left alive, John Adams. He found himself the sole patriarch of a village of women and children, the only person left who remembered the taste of English ale or the sound of a London street. John Adams underwent a strange, quiet transformation. He found a Bible in one of the crates saved from the Bounty and decided to turn his little kingdom of outcasts into the most pious, orderly society on earth. He taught the children to read using the ship's log and the scriptures. When an American ship accidentally stumbled upon the island 20 years later, they didn't find a gang of weathered pirates. They found a community of soft-spoken, deeply religious people who spoke a strange mix of English and Tahitian. There is an ironic piece to the end of the Bounty. The men who had started a revolution for the sake of freedom ended up creating a society that was more rigid and disciplined than the Navy they had fled. John Adams, the last mutineer, was eventually granted a royal pardon, a final shrug of the shoulders from an empire that had forgotten why it was angry in the first place. They lived out their days listening to the waves crash against the hull of an island that wasn't on any map, survivors of a dream that had burned as bright as a ship on fire,
and then faded into the Pacific mist.
Chapter 24. The Clockwork Wonders of the Enlightenment. We are drifting away from the heavy mahogany-scented courtrooms of Victorian London, floating back into the 18th century. The fog thins and transforms into the pale, elegant light of a Parisian workshop. The air here smells of fine oil, cut brass, and the faint, sweet scent of ozone. We have arrived in the golden age of the automaton, a time when the smartest minds in Europe weren't building computers, but mechanical humans. If the kings we visited earlier were obsessed with controlling people, the inventors of the Enlightenment were obsessed with mimicking life itself. Leading the charge was Jacques de Vaucanson. In 1738, he unveiled the flute player, a life-sized wooden figure that didn't just play music, it breathed. It had a complex system of bellows for lungs and flexible rubber skin on its fingers. It was so lifelike that people in the audience reportedly fainted, convinced they were witnessing a soul trapped in a box of gears. But Vaucanson's most famous and most bizarre creation was the digesting duck. It was a copper bird that could waddle, quack, drink water, and most famously eat grain and digest it. It was the ultimate 18th century parlor trick. People traveled across the continent to watch a mechanical bird perform its biological duties. It was a rhythmic, clockwork celebration of the mundane, proving that even the most basic acts of life could be reduced to a series of pulleys and levers. The irony of the automaton was that it reflected a new, terrifying way of looking at the world. Philosophers like René Descartes had suggested that the human body was essentially just a very complicated machine. To the people of the 1700s, these clockwork dolls weren't just toys, they were a mirror. If a machine could play the flute or digest a meal, what was left that made a human human? This reached its peak with the writer, built by the Jacques-Droz family. This was a clockwork boy, no larger than a child, who could sit at a desk, dip a real quill into an inkwell, and write a custom message of up to 40 letters. As he wrote, his eyes followed the text, and he would occasionally blow the dust off the paper. There is something profoundly haunting about the sight of him, a small, silent boy in a velvet suit, doomed to write the same beautiful sentences for eternity, powered by 6,000 moving parts. But the most famous automaton of all was a lie, the Turk. This was a mechanical chess player that defeated Benjamin Franklin and Napoleon Bonaparte. It seemed to be a miracle of engineering, a wooden figure in an Ottoman robe that could outthink the greatest minds of the age. In reality, it was a masterpiece of stage magic, concealing a small, cramped human chess master inside the cabinet. It was a machine that used a human to pretend to be a machine. There's a quiet, rhythmic beauty to these gears. They represent a time when we thought we could solve the mystery of life with a screwdriver and a bit of brass. But as the 18th century faded into the Industrial Revolution, the charming dolls were replaced by massive, grinding factory engines. The magic of the clockwork boy was lost to the utility of the steam loom. The workshop is growing dark now. The writer has put down his pen, the duck is silent, the gears have wound down, and the spring has lost its tension. We have reached the end of our gallery. The stories are all told, the lights are all out, and the history is finally at peace. The world is soft, the air is still, and there is nothing left to do but drift. Chapter 25. The Midnight Gardens of the Empress Elizabeth. We are drifting away from the rhythmic clicking and whirring of the Parisian workshops, floating through the cold, starlit air toward the east. The air turns sharp again, crystalline and biting,
smelling of frozen pine and the faint, expensive scent of ambergris. We have arrived at the Peterhof Palace outside St. Petersburg in the middle of the 18th century. This is the world of Empress Elizabeth of Russia, the daughter of Peter the Great, a woman who decided that the best way to deal with the crushing weight of an empire was to simply never go to sleep. Elizabeth was the Night Empress. Because she lived in a state of perpetual low-grade terror of being overthrown in her sleep, the same way she had seized the throne herself, she inverted the world. She would wake up at sunset and spend the entire night moving through her palaces like a restless ghost. This meant that the entire Russian court was forced into a state of permanent jet lag. If you wanted the Empress's favor, you had to be ready to dance a polonaise or discuss state secrets at 4 in the morning. Her favorite pastime was the Metamorphosis Ball. These were legendary parties where Elizabeth decreed that all the men must dress as women and all the women must dress as men. It wasn't about subversion, it was about vanity. Elizabeth had been told she had the most beautiful legs in Europe, and the only way she could legally show them off was to wear the tight-fitting breeches of a 17th century gentleman. Imagine the scene in the midnight gardens, hundreds of brawny Russian counts stumbling around in massive silk hoop skirts and lace veils, tripping over their own hems, while the Empress glided past in a velvet waistcoat, looking perfectly tailored and deeply amused. It was a world of flickering torches and distorted reflections, a massive, expensive masquerade conducted in the silence of the Russian forest. But behind the silk and the champagne, there was a strange, frantic emptiness. Elizabeth owned 15,000 dresses. She never wore the same outfit twice, and she would sometimes change her clothes 3 times in a single night. She was trying to outrun time with fashion. She would order the latest gowns from Paris, and if a courier was slow, she would have them thrown in prison. She wanted the world to be a constant shimmering present where the sun never rose and the party never ended. There is a quiet, icy irony to her reign. She was the woman who abolished the death penalty in Russia, yet she would have a lady-in-waiting's tongue cut out for repeating a bit of gossip she didn't like. She was deeply religious, spending her dawn hours on her knees in prayer, yet her life was a whirlwind of scandals and midnight feasts. As she aged, the gardens grew quieter. The Night Empress became a recluse, hiding in her rooms as her health failed, surrounded by the 15,000 dresses she would never wear again. When she finally died, the court simply went back to sleeping at night, as if the last 20 years had been nothing but a long, strange dream.
We are at the end of our journey now. The torches in the garden are sputtering out. The silk gowns are being packed away into cedar chests. The frost is creeping across the palace windows, blurring the world into a soft, white haze. Chapter 26. The Silent Hermits of the English Gardens. We are drifting away from the frozen, echoing ballrooms of St. Petersburg, floating back across the North Sea toward the rolling green hills of 18th century England. The air here is soft and damp, smelling of rain-soaked earth, crushed mint, and the heavy, sweet scent of overgrown boxwood. We have arrived in the era of the picturesque, a time when wealthy landowners decided that their gardens shouldn't just be beautiful, they should be melancholy. In the 1700s, an English gentleman's estate wasn't complete without a folly, a fake Roman ruin, a crumbling Gothic tower, or a damp, mossy grotto tucked away in the woods. But for the man who had everything, there was one ultimate accessory, a garden hermit.
Yes, for a period of several decades, it became a trend to hire a living person to dwell in your garden as a piece of decorative misery. The contract was usually quite specific. You would be provided with a stone hut, a Bible, an hourglass, and a mat of rushes. In return, you agreed not to cut your hair, not to trim your nails, and, most importantly, not to speak to a single soul for 7 years. Imagine the life of the ornamental hermit. You were paid to be a professional ghost. You sat in your grotto, staring at your hourglass, while the master of the house brought his guests by to peer at you through the foliage. You were a living symbol of contemplation and wisdom, a human prop used to give the garden a sense of ancient, weary history. It was a world of bizarre, rhythmic solitude. To the wealthy owners, the hermit was a way to outsource their own spirituality, as if by having a man pray and suffer in the woods on their property, they were somehow more profound. But for the hermits themselves, it was often a desperate gamble for a pension. Most didn't last the full 7 years. The dampness of the English caves and the sheer crushing boredom usually drove them back to the village tavern within a few months. There is one famous story of a Mr. Hamilton who hired a hermit for his estate at Painshill Park. He offered a massive fortune if the man could stay for 7 years under strict rules. The poor man lasted exactly 3 weeks before he was caught sneaking out to the local pub. He was fired on the spot, and the hermitage was left empty, a silent stone room waiting for a soul that never returned. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the trend faded. The living hermits were replaced by hermit automatons, clockwork monks who would nod their heads and turn the pages of a book when a visitor walked by. It was the ultimate irony. Even the business of being lonely and spiritual had been mechanized. The gardens of England are quiet now. The grottos are filled with ivy, and the stone huts are home only to owls and spiders. The men who sat in the dark, waiting for 7 years to pass, are long forgotten. They were the silent witnesses to a world that valued the appearance of depth over the reality of it.
In the 15th and 16th centuries, while Europe was slowly waking up to the Renaissance, this city was a shimmering intellectual oasis. It was the city of 333 saints, a place where the wealth of the salt trade was spent not on palaces or armies, but on ink and paper. The air in the narrow mud-brick streets hummed with the rhythmic scratching of thousands of quills. Imagine the private libraries of the desert scholars. These weren't grand buildings with marble pillars. They were hidden rooms in family homes, filled from floor to ceiling with manuscripts. There were books on everything: astronomy, mathematics, poetry, and intricate legal debates on the rights of women. These books were the city's soul. When a scholar died, his collection was divided among his children, like a treasure chest of jewels. But the desert is a patient predator. Over the centuries, as empires crumbled and trade routes shifted, the great libraries faced a slow, quiet threat, not just from the sand, which tried to bury the city every day, but from the humidity of the rainy season and the tiny rhythmic hunger of bookworms. The families of Timbuktu became the protectors of the ink. They did something incredible. To keep the knowledge safe from invaders and the elements, they hid the books. They buried them in trunks in the sand, walled them up inside secret chambers in their homes, or hid them in remote desert caves. For generations, the existence of these libraries became a family secret, passed down from father to son in whispers. A man might walk over a patch of sand every day, never telling a soul that beneath his feet lay 1,000 years of human thought. There is a profound, quiet courage in this. It was a culture that understood that gold can be stolen and salt can melt, but a story preserved
is a form of immortality. In recent years, when conflict again threatened the city, the descendants of those scholars repeated the ancient ritual, sneaking thousands of manuscripts out in the middle of the night, hidden under vegetables in donkey carts or tucked into fishing boats, to keep the ink of the scholars from being burned. The desert night is very still now. The wind is moving the dunes, but the books are silent in their trunks. The ink is dry, the paper is fragile, and the secrets are safe. The library of the sand is closed for the night, and the stars above Timbuktu are the only witnesses to the knowledge sleeping beneath the earth. Chapter 29. The Silent Ascent of the First Balloonists. We are drifting away from the sun-baked mud bricks of Timbuktu, floating upward until the golden dunes become a blur and then disappear entirely. The air grows cold and thin, smelling of wood smoke, wet silk, and the crisp ozone scent of the high atmosphere. We have arrived in the autumn of 1783 in the gardens of the Château de la Meute on the outskirts of Paris. This is the dawn of the balloonomania, the moment humanity first uncoupled itself from the earth. Imagine the sight of the first Montgolfier balloon. It wasn't a sleek, modern craft. It was a magnificent, gaudy palace of paper and blue silk, decorated with golden suns, zodiac signs, and the royal cipher of the king. It was powered by levity gas, which the Montgolfier brothers mistakenly believed was a special kind of smoke produced by burning damp straw and old wool coats. The first passengers weren't brave explorers, but a sheep named Montausiel climbed to the sky, a duck, and a rooster. The scientists of the day were genuinely worried that the air higher up might be poisonous, or that the lack of gravity would cause a living heart to burst. When the animals landed safely after an 8-minute flight, the duck was perfectly fine, though the sheep had accidentally stepped on the rooster. It was a humble, rhythmic beginning for the conquest of the sky. But the true sleepy beauty of early ballooning was the silence. Once the ropes were cut and the shouting of the crowds faded below, the aeronauts entered a world that no human had ever experienced. In a balloon, you don't feel the wind, because you are the wind. You move at exactly the same speed as the air around you. There is no vibration, no engine roar, only an absolute weightless stillness. The early balloonists, like Pilatre de Rosier and the Marquis d'Arland, spoke of the eerie clarity of the world from above. They could hear the barking of a dog or the sound of a church bell from 2 miles up, the sound traveling perfectly through the quiet air. They drifted over the patchwork fields of France, sipping champagne and eating cold chicken, while the world below looked like a toy theater. But there was a fragile irony to their flight. They were suspended by a giant bag of hot air and flammable paper, dangling over a literal fire burning in a brazier just inches below the silk. They had to frantically feed the fire with straw to keep from falling, while simultaneously using sponges and buckets of water to put out the sparks that constantly threatened to ignite their only hope of staying aloft. It was a rhythmic dance between fire and ice, between the desire to touch the stars and the reality of gravity. There is a profound, quiet courage in this. It was a culture that understood that gold can be stolen and salt can melt, but a story preserved is a form of immortality. In recent years, when conflict again threatened the city, the descendants of those scholars repeated the ancient ritual, sneaking thousands of manuscripts out in the middle of the night, hidden under vegetables in donkey carts or tucked into fishing boats, to keep the ink of the scholars from being burned. The desert night is very still now. The wind is moving the dunes, but the books are silent in their trunks. The ink is dry, the paper is fragile, and the secrets are safe. The library of the sand is closed for the night, and the stars above Timbuktu are the only witnesses to the knowledge sleeping beneath the earth. Chapter 30. The Clockwork Heavens of the Great Orreries. We are drifting away from the sighing silk and cooling embers of the Montgolfier balloon, descending through the clouds until we reach the quiet wood-paneled study of an 18th century earl. The air is still and heavy, smelling of old leather-bound books, beeswax, and the sharp metallic tang of polished brass.
If the first balloonists wanted to touch the sky, the builders of orreries wanted to own it. An orrery was a complex mechanical model of the solar system, where a turn of a single ivory crank would set the entire heavens in motion. Tiny spheres of ivory and brass, representing the Earth, the Moon, and the known planets, would begin their slow, rhythmic dance around a central golden sun. Imagine the master clockmaker working by the light of a single candle, filing gears so small they look like grains of sand. Each planet had to move at its own specific speed, the Earth rotating once for every 365 turns of the central gear, while tiny Mercury zipped around the Sun and distant Saturn crawled with a heavy, majestic slowness. It was the universe reduced to the size of a dinner table, a way for a gentleman to feel like the architect of creation while sipping his evening tea. There is a quiet, meditative irony in these machines. They were built during the Age of Reason, when humans believed that if we could just build a perfect enough model, we could understand the mind of God. When you watched an orrery, you weren't looking at the real stars, which were cold and unimaginably far away. You were looking at a tamed version of space. It was a universe you could stop with your finger, a sky you could polish with a silk cloth. The most famous painting of this era, by Joseph Wright of Derby, shows a group of children gathered around an orrery in a darkened room. Their faces are illuminated from below by a single lamp hidden inside the sun. You can see the wonder in their eyes, a mixture of scientific curiosity and old-fashioned awe. To them, the clicking of the brass teeth was the heartbeat of the world. They believed that the stars followed the same predictable rhythmic rules as the family clock. But as the 19th century approached, the orreries began to gather dust. Telescopes grew larger, and we realized the universe was far more chaotic and vast than a collection of brass gears could ever show. The perfect machine was replaced by the realization of infinite empty space. The orreries were moved from the center of the room to the corners of the library, their ivory moons frozen in mid-orbit, their golden suns tarnished by the passage of time. There is a haunting beauty in a stopped orrery. It represents a moment when we thought we had it all figured out. It's a silent chorus of gears, waiting for a hand that will never come back to turn the crank. The study is growing very dim now. The last of the candlelight is reflecting off the brass rings of the Saturn gear. The ivory earth is still. The clock on the mantel has slowed its ticking, blending into the heavy silence of the house. The machine has wound down. The heavens are at rest. The stars are safe in their places. Sleep well. Chapter 31. The Heavy Silence of the Diving Bell. We are drifting away from the rhythmic clicking of the orreries, leaving the wood-paneled study and floating back toward the salt-heavy air of the harbor. The air is damp and cool, smelling of tarred rope, wet iron, and the deep, cold mystery of the sea. We have arrived in the late 1700s, standing on the deck of a salvage ship. This is the era of the first practical diving bells, the heavy iron lungs that allowed humans to visit a world that had always been forbidden. Imagine the diving bell hanging from a wooden crane, a massive bell-shaped chamber of cast iron or lead-lined oak weighing several tons.
It was open at the bottom, using the simple rhythmic physics of air pressure to keep the water out. To look at it was to see a giant inverted thimble ready to be pushed into the crushing blue of the Atlantic. In 1691, the astronomer Edmund Halley, the same man who tracked the comet, designed a version that used weighted barrels of fresh air sent down from the surface. It was a slow, deliberate process. The divers inside would wait in the dim, greenish light as a barrel was lowered. Then they would pull a hose into the bell to drink the new air. It was a life sustained by a rhythmic delivery of wooden casks, a fragile umbilical cord stretching through the dark water. Think of the silence inside that bell. Once you descended a few fathoms, the sound of the waves and the shouting of the sailors vanished. You were in a world of absolute heavy stillness, where the only sound was the slow thrum of your own heart and the occasional hiss of air bubbles escaping from the rim. The light was strange and filtered, a ghostly emerald that made your own hands look like they belonged to a stranger. But the industrial deep was a place of terrible, quiet irony. In 1783, Charles Spalding, a confectioner from Edinburgh who had turned his genius to the sea, descended in his own bell off the coast of Ireland. He had added a system of balance weights and signaling ropes. He thought he had mastered the pressure, but something went wrong in the dark. The air supply failed, and the very machine meant to protect him became a heavy iron coffin. The man who spent his life making sweets died in a world that was salty, cold, and utterly indifferent. The diving bells were the first step in a journey that would eventually lead to submarines and deep-sea suits, but in the 18th century they were a solitary rhythmic bridge between two worlds. They allowed us to reclaim the treasures of sunken galleons, the silver bars and brass cannons, but they always reminded us that we were guests in a kingdom that didn't want us. The salvage ship is quiet now. The iron bell has been hauled back onto the deck, dripping and cold. The ropes are coiled, and the lanterns are being extinguished. The ocean is reclaiming its silence, the waves folding over each other in a dark, rhythmic sleep. The descent is over. The pressure is gone. The water is still.